The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
I trust that in God's divine design for all things, none of it's inefficient. Like he's actually weaving it as a master storyteller, so everything has a point. But we don't have the perspective to see it and to get it, which I, again, think it gives us the ability to fail. Because if the failure from our perspective, we have no idea what God intends through my failed essay.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Weakness doesn't usually feel like a gift, but author, podcaster, and songwriter Eric Schumacher believes that it is. His new book is The Good Gift of Weakness, God's Strength Made Perfect and the Story of Redemption. In this episode, Eric and I talk about the gifts that follow when we come to terms with our weakness, what it means to be in a posture to receive rather than to strive, and the relief that comes from letting go of the need to control. Eric Schumacher, so great to have you here on the Habit Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah. Your new book is The Good Gift of Weakness. So let's start with the obvious question. How is weakness a good gift?
Yeah. Well, simple answer is God created us weak. And everything that God made is good, and it's a gift. But maybe a longer answer than that is, I define weakness as the inability to act or produce an effect. And we see from the beginning of creation that we depend upon God for everything. We couldn't exist without Him. He gives us our place. He gives us our provision, our food. He gives us, it's not good for man to be alone. He gives us partners to work with. And all of that's good because it causes us to rely entirely upon Him for His gracious provision. And in that way, we get to experience His strength and His beauty and all that He is. And that's a good gift He gives us Himself.
Yeah. So that definition again, power is the ability to, what'd you say, create change?
To act or produce an effect.
To produce an effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is weakness the same thing as powerlessness?
Well, the dictionary definition of weakness was the absence of strength.
Yeah.
Or the absence of power. And so I reverse engineered it there. So, but that doesn't mean we don't have given strength. They're just not inherent to us. God God gives them to us, animates them, and
Uh-huh.
they come from Him. So even the relative strengths we have and the abilities we have don't come because we've produced them on our own, but because God enables them.
Uh-huh. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so it feels like you're getting back to the idea of, God is the unmoved mover, God is the first mover,
Mm-hmm.
and all motion and all power, is
Mm-hmm.
derivative. And yeah, okay. So a recurring theme, and I may be, you can help me if I'm in any way misrepresenting you, but the idea of, one of the gifts of weaknesses is it reminds us of the need to be in a position to receive.
Mm-hmm.
And as opposed to living out of our striving.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm interested in hearing you talk about the way that principle, that idea of receiving instead of striving,
Mm-hmm.
how that has shaped your creative work. What are the what are the insights for a writer that derive from that understanding of any power we have is received?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's certainly made me pray more. And I think any of us creative types have had the experience where, if you're a songwriter, you've written 100 songs and you sit down to write another one and you're like, I have no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Or write a book and you sit down and you're like, what did I get myself into? And I think just beginning from that posture of, God, I need your help to do this thing I believe that you've called me to do. And I would emphasize that weakness doesn't necessarily call for an inactivity. There's times in the Bible where God says, I want you to stand back and be quiet and watch. Here's what I'm going to do. But, we had creative type, skilled craftsmen who built the temple. They were gifted by God, and I'm assuming they worked very hard at their craft to get better.
Yeah.
But the posture should be, this isn't inherent to me. No matter how much I've worked at the craft of writing songs or books or whatever, God could take that away in an instant. And I want to go into this going, God, I want you to animate me. I want you to lead my thoughts and my abilities and enable me to do this. I'm doing this. I'm creating because you're the creator who's made me to be this way, and it comes from you.
Yeah. So, how do you fit human will into the equation here? I mean, obviously, there was you exercised your will in writing this book about weakness to sit down and write about what you wrote about.
Yeah. And I'll say that this was one of the hardest things I've written. And I felt like in the process of writing it, I came in, obviously not all my weaknesses, but it felt like I came face to face with so many of my weaknesses. And there were times where I felt like, I don't think I can write this. I just, and you've probably had that experience, where you're like, the act of writing, is putting words down. I mean, it sounds so simple. Like, I think people who haven't tried it are like, what's so hard about it? You just sit down and you put words there.
Yeah.
And there were times where I have to write this book, I'm under contract, and I just felt like I physically and mentally felt like I cannot do this. And what I would do is I would sit down and go, Lord, I think you're worthy of a book that glorifies your strength and weakness. I don't feel like I can do this. And I'm going to start typing words and I'm trusting you to show up. Yeah. And so I actually, what happened for me is I think, because there's been times where I've trusted in my strength and been like, I'm good enough to do these things. I can do these things. And then I hit that point and I just give up and I stop. And I think embracing the idea that he is my strength, the Psalms say that over and over, the Lord, my strength, it frees me to exert my will because I'm believing he's going to show up as I do that. And I'm entering it trusting in him and not in myself. And I just found it to be a very freeing thing. Embracing weakness has made me more willing to try hard at things than when I'm trusting in my own strength.
Can you say one or two more sentences about why you think that's true? That leaning into your weakness has made you more willing to try harder. Did I say that right? Did you say that?
Yeah.
Try harder?
I think I said that. Yeah. To exert my will and to try harder and to do better.
Yeah.
It's when we can't trust our God, we don't want to move forward.
Yeah.
And if my God is me as the creator,
yeah,
I see tasks that I'm approaching, like writing a book or a song. And if I don't trust that I can do it, I'm going to give up. Yeah. But if I trust I have a God who has gifted me, and this is a vocation, then I can trust him to show up. And so I'm going to move into that act by faith because I have a God who shows up and can be relied on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I was just thinking, when you're saying, if I'm my own God and you can't move forward, the question is, when you're on your, when you are your own God and you say, if I fail, what kind of God am I?
Yeah,
not a very good one.
I'm a puny God. Yeah. And heaven forbid I succeed in that mindset. I'm just deep in my own idolatry.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to fail at some point.
That's a great insight that in that scenario, success is more dangerous than failure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And when you lean into your weakness and when you say, all my strength comes from God, failure is not a complete disaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I appreciate that you're not saying I can do all things through God who strengthens me. Therefore, it's going to be brilliant every time I sit down to write if I'm just trusting God.
Yeah. No, sometimes it looks like a complete disaster.
Yeah.
But I can trust him then, like it's not the outcome I wanted, but I've thrown myself on the mercy of an all powerful and all loving and all wise God. And yeah, and then I can sit back in what feels like failure and go, I don't get it.
Yeah.
But I can trust this God.
Yeah. 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 You say it's not the outcome you wanted, but also we're terrible at knowing what we actually want.
Oh yeah. All the time. If God answered all my prayers, I'd be in a much worse place and the world would be a much worse place, I'm sure.
Yeah. I love that line from Tim Keller that, when God doesn't, I'm paraphrasing, but when God doesn't give you what you're asking for, what he gives you instead is what you would have asked for if you'd known what he knows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's a comfort for us as creative types, because how many times have we sat down, I want to write this poem, I want to write this book, I want to write this article, and it doesn't happen. It just flops. And then the next thing we move on to is great.
Yeah.
And had the first thing succeeded, we'd still be spending our time on that. But that doesn't seem to be what God wanted us to do. And we wouldn't have discovered and made the other thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. Okay. I was thinking there was something else about that question, some other corner we had not poked into. Well, I may remember later what that was. Okay, I love the idea that you dug into early in the book, chapter 1, I think, that God's power is not utilitarian. And I think that's, it's prodigal. I don't know if you use that word, but there's a lot of unnecessariness going on
Yeah, it's
in the way God
extravagant.
exerts his power.
Yeah.
And I'd love to spend a little time with that. And again, what that means for a person who does creative work. So I'm sure you've done some thinking about this. What are the truth that, well, if you think about engineering and the whole point of engineering is to, exert as much, maybe I should say the whole point of engineering, but an engineering approach is I'm going to exert as much power in the most useful way with the least resistance, and that's just not the way,
Yeah.
the
No.
way God exerts power. So,
Yeah. I think I was making that point in the creation story, just thinking about it, the provision of food, that, the need for food, he designed us to need to eat.
Yeah.
And that's a daily reminder that we don't sustain ourselves. But the way he provided for us was this glorious banquet of, fruit trees and plants. And he didn't make some, dystopian novel sludge, that it meets all
Nutrition pills.
your needs. Yeah, something like that. And that's just a microcosm of, this book is exploring biblical theology. Really, it moves from Genesis to Revelation, examining the theme of weakness through the whole story, and the different ways that God works through weakness through the whole story. It's manifold, and I think what that means is, and we know this, God could have displayed his glory, I guess, snapping his fingers, and everything's just one way. But he designed a story to unfold over thousands and thousands of years, various cultures, and all of that. And all of those moments are different. His beauty, his glory is like a multifaceted gemstone. And all of those extravagances, that prodigalness of God, like you said, is different facets of his strength and his power and his glory and his wisdom put on display. And I think that's, if we're called to be creators like he's a creator, that's what novels are all about, right? Like, you have a point, but you take a long time getting there, and you might not even make it explicit.
Yeah.
And
you might not know what your point is when you start.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's better because of the journey than just a sentence written to state a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That idea of abundance and inefficiency also, I think, takes us back to the idea we were talking about a minute ago, that failure, a failed effort is not a catastrophe, because there's always more where that came from. And when I fail at writing an essay, all I've done is failed at writing an essay. I've not failed as a human being. I'm not even failed as a writer. And there's something, in that whole trajectory. It may not be efficient, but it's ultimately effective. And in all the waste and the ways that I put forth effort that feels like it didn't pay off, it's not actually wasted.
Yeah. And I think that's something that came out to me. I have a chapter on weakness in wisdom literature, and Job's demand is, God, you need to answer for this, and God tells him, put on your big boy pants. We're going to have a conversation here, and you're going to answer me. And he asked him all these questions. Creation founded on wisdom, and he asked them, were you there when I did this? Were you there? Do you understand this and this and this? And Job can't answer any of the questions. And part of the purpose of that is to understand the limitedness, maybe even the weakness of human wisdom, that we cannot, because we're creatures, have God's perspective on why he's doing these things. And so, like, talking about inefficiency, like, I trust that in God's divine design for all things, none of it's inefficient. Like, he's actually weaving it as a master storyteller, so everything has a point. But we don't have the perspective to see it and to get it, which I, again, think it gives us the ability to fail, because it's a failure from our perspective. We have no idea what God intends through my failed essay.
Yeah. Yeah. Or any other failure. I mean,
Any other failure.
I know we're talking about, sort of the creative. Thank you for framing it in terms of creativity. So I didn't have to. So I appreciate that. I'm always trying to nudge guests toward creativity. All right. I didn't ask you ahead of time how much you were willing to talk about the epilogue. I kind of hate to talk about the end of the book, but I loved your epilogue. Are you willing to talk a little bit about that epilogue?
Yeah.
I was really impressed with your the vulnerability that you were willing to show there by telling, basically, when you stopped being a lead pastor, you've told that story a few times before, and in this epilogue, you said, maybe I'll tell a little more of that story than I have before. And that took some courage, and so can you talk to me about the difference between? So I think you wrote an article, I think in Fathom magazine, about that episode.
Yeah.
When was that? Was about 10 years ago that you would have written that article?
It's probably maybe 7 or 8 years ago.
Okay. Yeah. And you didn't tell all you could have told.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. And you've told more. There may be more to tell that you haven't told, but
there's actually 2 different nights. And so one was the night where I wept face down on the carpet all night until I woke up with my nose bleeding into the carpet. And I was, and just background for listeners, there's a whole story of me, and this book isn't a theological exercise for me, exploring weakness. It's a theological book, but it's not a theological exercise. It's life and death for me. Because I lived for a long time worshiping at this altar of strength and my own greatness and wanting to get my own glory. And even as a Christian, it's our flesh, and it's all mixed up. Sure. I want to glorify God, but I wanted to make myself something great. And so I wrote this article about that night, one of my worst nights, and how God led me to a greater degree out of seeking my own glory and all that. But there's this later night that I talk about in the epilogue of the book, a different night where I'm working to manuscript a sermon. And the reason I'm working to manuscript, it's the middle of the night, and I've been manuscripting sermons because I want to have the greatest sermons possible, so that I have this collection of sermons at the end of my life, this legacy of 50 years of preaching and all that. And I've been preaching out of the same Bible the whole time. And I'm exhausted, I'm bitter, I'm angry. Church is not going well. People aren't responding to me the way I think they should. And even the people who love me, that's just pressure that I can't let them down now, and I wanted to go to bed. I just wanted to sleep. I wanted rest. And I was despairing of life at that point. And I looked down at my Bible, and it represented this idol that I had made of who I wanted to be. And I picked it up and I.
So wait, before you tell what happened,
okay.
So you sort of envisioned you're going to preach out of this Bible for 50 years.
Yeah.
And then you're going to pass it along to
I'm going to give it to one of my children or my grandchildren. It'll be this legacy Bible of Eric's 50-year, legacy of preaching. And I looked down at it, and it represented everything that I had made or wanted to make. And I just picked it up and I tore it. And I'm not sure I tore the leather cover, but I tore on it, and the paper, the book itself tore in two. And then I used this overflow I don't even know what it was, angst and anger and everything. And I just started tearing pages, tearing, and tearing it smaller. And I didn't rip the whole entire thing to shreds, but there was little onion skin confetti all over the floor. And I ended up, and then I saw that and I hated that, and I kicked this louvered door in my office, thinking it would swing open and shut. And it came out of the hinges and landed on the floor in a giant crash.
Sorry, I'm laughing. That's not funny.
No, I get it. Like one of those you laugh or you cry. And it lands on the floor with a crash, and I just land next to it in a ball, weeping. And I'm just done. I don't even know what to do. And Jenny comes down the stairs, because she hears the crash. It's 3 a.m. or whatever, and she comes down and she just says, "Oh, Eric," and I thought, is she gonna scold me? Is she gonna, what in the world, and it was just so gracious. And she tells me to go to bed, and she picks up the Bible and puts it all in a gallon-sized Ziploc bag, and there's no fixing this thing. Like it's beyond repair. And I went to church, and I don't know how I preached, but I did something, and told an elder after church, and when I looked up telling the story, he's just weeping and full of grace, gives me his car keys, because our family had ridden together, gives me his car keys, says, drive home and, take my truck home and go take a nap. And I'm going to talk to the elders, make sure you're cared for, and just grace upon grace upon grace. And, so anyway, that's that story. And I didn't think I could tell that before. Like, I thought, it's one thing to be able to talk about weeping so hard through the night that you're bleeding into the carpet. But who rips up their Bible? Like, what kind of pastor tears his Bible to shreds? And I just thought, that story I can't tell that. What would people think of me? And so as I'm writing this book, and one of the weaknesses of the book that I mentioned is, like, I didn't feel like I was vulnerable enough in writing it. I get more vulnerable as the book goes on. I think that's because I'm learning more about weakness. The early stories are stories about childhood and faith and all that. And so I finished the book, turned in my manuscript, and my editor said, "It doesn't feel finished. Can you write some kind of epilogue?" And
this was after you had turned in the manuscript that you wrote the epilogue. Really?
Yeah. So he said, "It just doesn't feel finished. I think we need a little epilogue, especially maybe how this has changed you." And really, the book ends, of course, with 3 chapters on Jesus and weakness in his life and ministry, and then a chapter on weakness in the Christian life, which focuses on Paul, and then weakness in the new heavens and new earth. And so Jesus and Paul, like, they challenged me so much. A friend pointed out that you see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he invites his friend to follow him into the garden, and he is weeping. He says, "I'm sorrowful to the point of death." Yeah. He's praying in such agony that he's sweating like drops of blood, and he's inviting his friends to watch. Jesus put that on display in front of his friends. And then you have Paul boasting about how weak he is in a culture where you make up these brag sheets about how many times you've done what great things. And he's like, I got shipwrecked, stoned, beaten. And then the capstone is like, I ran away in Damascus, like, I swear I'm not lying. I actually got let down through the wall. And that would have been really shameful in that culture. The Roman army valued the first man over the wall into a city, and Paul's like, I was the first one out. Yeah. And it made me realize, like, when the author of Hebrews says that Jesus had to be made like his brothers and sisters in every respect, but without sin, Jesus became, in his human nature, as weak as me. And that night in the garden, like, reminds me, Jesus can look at me. Of course, he never sinned. But he could look at me in that moment of my utter weakness and go, I know what that's like, Eric. I know what that's like, but he didn't sin. And so his righteousness in enduring that kind of weakness without sin is credited to me. And whatever sins I was committing in that breakdown, he bore on the cross. And admitting that weakness and telling that story will not ever in any way separate me from the love of God in Christ. And Paul says, I'm going to boast. I'm going to brag about how weak I am because Jesus has told me that his grace is sufficient and his power is brought to its complete end, perfected in my weakness. And Paul put that all on display because then Christ shines. And I'm thinking, it dawned on me that when Paul says, like, they say he's weak in appearance and his speaking skills are weak. And he says, I preached in fear and much trembling. Like, he wasn't lying. He was afraid and he trembled. And he looked really weak in front of people. And he wasn't afraid of that. And I thought, he's just like me. Huh. I think of Paul as some superhero. No, he's a weak human being that God chose as a vessel to display his strength through. And I thought, how can I shrink back from speaking about some of my weakest moments? If Jesus he put all of his weakness on display on the cross. I mean, what's weaker than a king hanging naked and dying in front of mocking people? I just thought, I'm free. I'm free to share this story that I'm so ashamed of. I'm still ashamed of it.
Really?
But it's where I experienced so much the grace of Christ. Yeah. And I want people to see it so that people who feel the same way about their life can know there's grace there.
Yeah.
God's power is there.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What was the last thing you said?
No, I was just saying God's power is there.
Yeah. You said that telling that story or whatever sins you committed in that terrible moment aren't going to separate you from the love of God in Christ. And it occurs to me, not only is it not going to separate you, it's going to draw you closer to God and to people you tell that story to.
That's true. Yeah.
So how did you, I want to talk about your relationship, what that editor did for you, because in pushing you to be a little more vulnerable, you tell me, I guess, were these insights that were implicit, and by being challenged like that became explicit, and you said, I'm really free to tell this story?
Yeah. So that article you mentioned that was written for Fathom magazine, I was in some kind of writer's workshop with Lori Ferguson Wilbert.
Okay.
And those of us that were in this cohort, she challenged, I want you to write a first person piece about a time that you failed, something that you failed at, and then I want you, at the end of this, I want you to pursue publishing. And so she really pushed me to be vulnerable in that article and to publish it. And my editor for the book, he didn't know about that story of me ripping up my Bible. But he, there's a few places we went. I always asked him, is this too much? And he was encouraging to go for it. But I hard to describe what he did for me there, because I think it's what a good editor does, is there's something still missing from this. I don't even think he knew what it was, but he knew wasn't there.
He knew something was missing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And challenged me to put it there.
Yeah. It's a good editor.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thankful for him.
Yeah. He did something good for you, and he did something good for the rest of us.
Yeah.
To read your book. Yeah. Well, Eric, one thing I want to hear from you before we go is, who are the writers who make you want to write?
I love that question. I think I love Marilyn Robinson, and I especially love Wendell Berry.
You better love Marilyn Robinson, being an Iowa boy, Iowa preacher.
Yeah, yeah, and I love Flannery O'Connor, and I love a novel novella actually that I revisited recently is Remembering Laughter by Walter Stanger, which is set in Iowa, and it's one that pulls the heart out of your chest and bounce on it, and it's so good. But it's interesting because I'm writing nonfiction. I've written 5 nonfiction books in the last 4 years, and what I really want to be doing is writing fiction. But the people who make me want to write are fiction writers, and it's these authors who put all of the world on display.
Oh yeah,
its beauty and its ugliness, and so even when I write nonfiction, I'm wanting to explain why they work and why that's so good. That's what this book is trying to do. Is why when an author paints a picture of our failings and weaknesses does it resonate so much? And it inspires me to write better nonfiction.
Yeah.
It was hard for me to even come up with any. There are nonfiction authors that make me want to write, but the first things that come to mind are fiction writers.
That's great to know. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And as you were talking about, I don't know what it was, but you telling the story of sort of, basically you told the story of wanting to be John Ames from Gilead, and then realizing you were something else. Something else that God also loves. And you tearing up that Bible, I thought, even when I was reading the story, I was thinking about John Ames. And it's not the kind of thing I could imagine John Ames doing, but he also had his challenges, didn't he? In terms of
maybe Jack would do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for being here, Eric. And it's always a pleasure. So thanks for being here, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Likewise. Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.